it's now time. No, but it's okay, thanks. Yeah. Good. So, as you for sure have noticed, this year we have tried to have a combination of keynotes, some of them coming from inside the tourism community, and some others coming from outside. So to foster cross-semination of ideas and to foster this kind of bridging activity, which we believe is one of the main missions of our association. So I met Jukka Onnela. I've never learned how to pronounce Jukka Pekka, I'm not sure. So JP is perfect. Jukka Onnela, I've met him in a conference where he presented a very interesting case in India about a religious festival happening every 144 years. So it's not that easy to get it the very right moment. And his perspective is big data and biostatistics, public health, and such a thing. But still, a big event is for sure something which is fully of interest of people studying tourism, and in this case, cultural religious tourism. So I was highly motivated to invite him to present the kind of research he's doing about big data and biostatistics, and I believe that that kind of research will be highly inspiring also for all of us. So thank you for having accepted to be here with us today, and I'm looking forward to learning from you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, and a warm thank you to the invitation. It's great to be here. It's my second time in Lugano, and I had a blast the first time, and the second time has been even better. And thank you also for showing up on a somewhat rainy afternoon. So I wanted to talk about some of the work that we've done in 2 or 3 different contexts. I'm not even a biostatistician strictly. My original training is in physics. I'm somewhere between physics and biostatistics and public health. And so I'm certainly not in tourism, but I was hoping that some of the work that we've done, we've learned a few things along the way. And my hope is that I could convey some of these success stories more or less to you. And there might be some lessons that you as a field might be able to take away from the work that we've done. So let me just take a step back and think about the big picture. Everybody's talking about a lot of data, but I wanted to go back to the roots, the fundamentals of where these data are coming from in my perspective. So progress in science, I'm a scientist, so I think about science a lot. So progress in science has always been driven by the availability of different kinds of data. And more recently, we've really had this explosion in the types of data that are available, both for scientific research purposes, but also for commercial research purposes. And a lot of people are talking about this term, or using this term, big data. I'm not a huge fan of the term, but it seems like that's the term that we're not going to be stuck with, so I'll just use that term for convention. When people talk about the term big data, usually we're thinking about data that has 3 specific types of features to it. And these 3 features are known as the 3 V's of big data, which are often summarized as volume, velocity, and variety. So we had yesterday an interesting panel discussion here at the same time, actually, and I was talking about this and debating the issue of big data with a couple of panelists, and the audience asked excellent questions then. And I also expressed my view then on big data, which is that I think that to a large extent, the excitement around big data is warranted, but there's also a lot of hype, I think, around big data. I'm personally the least excited about the volume aspect of big data, because for many research questions, we don't necessarily need millions and millions or billions and billions of data points. So the example I brought up yesterday was one of political polling. So if you want to know if the Democrats are doing well or if the Republicans are doing well, you don't have to ask 50 million people in the US. It's enough to ask about 1,000 people. If you have asked 5,000 people, you already have a great sample. So sometimes you don't need those enormous volumes of data. Velocity of data is interesting. So velocity refers to the data, instead of arriving in 1 or 2 or 3 batches, essentially arrive in continuous time. And that has some clear uses if you're thinking about things like prediction and so on. But the one aspect of the 3 that I'm most excited about in the context of big data is the variety of data. And I think that that's where the scientific enterprise has the most benefit from. So I think that from my perspective, the V standing for variety is the most interesting and exciting. Now, if we think about the origin of all these data, it already goes back to Moore's law. So Moore's law is a prediction that was made more than 4 decades ago. And essentially what it states is that the number of transistors we can fit on a microchip approximately doubles every 18 months. It's easy to make predictions, but it's hard to make predictions that actually turned out to be true historically. And Moore's law is one of these phenomenal predictions that has held for more than 40 years. So in this plot, which is too small for you to see probably, but what we have on the x-axis is time going all the way from 1970 to more or less present day. The data points here, what we have on the y-axis is the number of transistors that engineers were able to fit on a single chip. The y-axis is logarithmic, and the data points correspond to individual microchips. So what you can see is that in this plot, the dots pretty nicely line up with the fit, which is just a straight line, which in this kind of plot refers to exponential growth. So in short, Moore appears to have been right. And this growth seems to continue even to this day. So why should we care about this? Well, this has at least 2 consequences that I think should influence all of us. So one of these consequences, one of these implications is data. So what that means is sensors are cheap to make. That means that we can put them everywhere. And as a consequence, we're able to collect more data. But data alone is not enough. What this same law has enabled is fantastic development in computational capacity. So it's ultimately, in my opinion, due to Moore's law that we have both data and then the machinery to do something with these data. And I think this is a fantastic time to be a scientist. In general, it's a great time to be around, to be part of this revolution. 2015 is a remarkable year if we think about mobile technology. So 2015 is the first year in our history that we have more mobile phones in use than there are people on this planet. That doesn't mean that everybody has a mobile phone, because some people have 2 or 3, but on average, to have one. It's some kind of a turning point. Now, why should we care about this? So I think the most exciting thing about having mobile phones and smartphones is that they enable us to collect data on human behavior in real-world contexts. And I call that in situ. So if you know anything about biological research, people often distinguish between in vivo and in vitro. So the idea that you can have something in a living tissue or something in a test tube. So I think what's really exciting about this new technology is that we can be collecting data from people as they're experiencing their daily lives in situ, in the actual context, where also all of the decision-making happens. If we think about the bigger picture more broadly, biology used to be very much a lab science, but in the last decade and a half, has very much become a computational information science. Also, thank you. Also, social and behavioral sciences are heading and have been heading in this direction. And one of the things that I've been trying to do, that's my 2 cents, is try to push this approach to public health and medicine. And why do I think that this might actually work in that area? And my reasoning is pretty simple. People are connected, and therefore our health is connected. So anything that we can do to learn about health at the individual level, and if you can do something to learn about the connections between individuals, that should ultimately result in. Great. Thank you for thinking. Thank you. Yes, that would be interesting. Thank you. Good thinking. So what do I do? So my day job is I run a lab. And we do 2 different kinds of research. So I'm a network scientist by training, so we develop methods to study social and biological networks. Some of these methods are mathematical. We also develop computational tools, algorithms, and things like that. And we also do a lot of applied work in this area. This is one of the two research areas. The second research area is what I call digital phenotyping. This is maybe not the best term, and we're still working on what might be the best word for this, but the idea here is that we can use smartphones or data from mobile devices more broadly to learn about human behavior. And I'll be talking about one aspect of this research, and that's what I call digital psychiatry. Again, the term that we're working on, but just to have a label for this. So I already mentioned that we can use cell phones and smartphones to learn about behavior of individuals, but we can also learn about the structure of connections. And there are fundamentally two different ways that we can do this. One approach is that we can go to telecom, to phone operators, and ask them to give us anonymized data at large scale, so we can get data for potentially millions and millions of individuals. Using this approach, we get a very large sample size, but the data are not that rich. They're reasonably rich, but they're not incredibly rich. The second approach involves essentially developing some kind of a smartphone application and actively instrumenting people. So this means recruiting people in a study, for example, having them install that smartphone application, they give their consent, and then we can collect all kinds of data. So this is what I think of as my MBA diagram. I don't actually have an MBA, but I think of this as my MBA diagram. So this is completely schematic and mostly made up anyway. So there are two dimensions to this plot. On the x-axis, we have sample size. On the y-axis, we have the richness of data. So if we think about the former approach, which is you use pre-existing records, we're somewhere here on this curve. So we have very large sample size, but the data are not that rich. If we do the other approach, the second approach, which is using the smartphone application, we are usually constrained to much smaller sample sizes, at least for now, but the data that we can collect are incredibly rich. So what I wanted to accomplish was to talk about some of the work that we've done. Everything's going to be very superficial in the sense that I will not be going into great details here, but if you're interested, I'm happy to talk offline anytime. And the idea is that I'm just going to pick a few, 3, 4, 5 case studies that we've done over the last few years and highlight the kind of work that we've been able to do because of the kinds of data we've had and because of the capability that we've tried to develop to usefully analyze and model these data. And then what I'd like you to be thinking about is, might there be some applications of some of the stuff that we've done to the work that you're interested in? And I think we'll have 15 minutes for questions at the end. We'll have more if I spill the water in my laptop, but hopefully that won't happen. All right, so two big topics for today. One is social networks and human behavior, and the second topic is mental health. So let's start with the social network and human behavior part. Now, many questions of scientific, societal, commercial interest, many systems like these can be depicted as networks. So a very brief introduction to networks would be, in a network description of a system, we have two different kinds of elements. We represent the entities or the elements or the agents in the system as nodes, and if these two nodes interacted in some way in the physical world, we draw a line between the two of them. The easiest example might be a social network where the nodes are individual people, and there's a tie connecting two people if they're friends with one another. If you want to think about something a little more sophisticated, you could be thinking about something like a biological network, where the nodes could correspond to proteins. Proteins are these incredibly complicated macromolecules, and they have very complicated shapes. And because of their shapes, they have very specific distributions of charges on their surfaces. And what that means is that some proteins can physically interact with one another. They fit together really well, whereas some proteins cannot. So we can think about a network where the nodes are all the proteins that might exist in the human cell, for example, and we draw a line between any two proteins if they interact. If they don't, we don't draw that line. Now, when we think about visualizing or drawing networks, we don't care about the actual placement of nodes. So you could take this picture on its side, and it would still represent the very same network. So when we think about networks, what's key is what are the nodes that are connected to one another, and what are the nodes that are not connected to one another. So you could imagine taking this picture and imagine that the edges are made of some kind of rubber band. And you can move these nodes around as much as you want, as long as any two nodes that are connected in this picture, like nodes 4 and 13, as long as they remain connected, you're still looking at the same graph. I teach a semester-long course on networks at Harvard, but this was basically a 2-minute summary of the class that we do. So this is a very, very, very brief introduction to networks. One of the classic examples that people look at in the context of social networks is what's called the Zachary Karate Club. So very briefly, he was a sociology PhD student at some point in the 70s in the US. And these nodes here represent Karate Club members. And he spent about 2 years studying this particular Karate Club. And two people are connected if there is a tie, if they're friends with one another outside of the Karate Club. And an interesting thing happened at the club at some point in the middle of his observation. There were two important figures in this organization, and they didn't get along. As a consequence, the club was split into two. So instead of having just one club, now all of a sudden we have two clubs. And the question is, which club did these individual members decide to join? It turns out that this is a classic problem, both in graph theory and network science. We can take pre-existing algorithms, and we can throw this network at one of these algorithms, and we can ask the computer to perform this calculation. Why is this interesting? Well, a group splitting into two is a large-scale phenomenon. But the data that we have exists at the level of pairs of individuals. So giving pairwise or microscopic data, we might be able to learn how an organization, in this case a karate club, comes apart. And you can imagine that you might repeat these kinds of analyses for all kinds of organizations based on their email communications and so on. So moving forward, one of the key data sources that we have had is what are called call detail records, or CDRs. So this is these are very interesting data sets and very rich data sets. So why is that the case? Well, these data describe pairwise communication events. I call you, and so on. So two people are always involved. So what that means, we can draw networks from these data. The second reason why these are interesting is because in some cases, not often, but sometimes, spatial location is available. What that means is, when I talk on the phone, the call has to be routed by one specific cell tower, otherwise I can't talk to anyone. Some operators keep track of these cell towers, so we can learn my location and his location when we are doing that call, but only during the time of the call. An important feature of the data that we've always had is that all of the data have been anonymized. So the company, of course, has the actual phone numbers and so on, but we don't want those. We don't care about them. We only care about generalizable knowledge because we're scientists. So that's why the company would take the set of phone numbers, hash them, and essentially into surrogate keys. And those are the kinds of data that we analyze. Typically, these kinds of data are also temporally aggregated. And sometimes we might have some basic demographic data also available. So let's see, this is all just completely made up. So in this case, this might be a typical example of a data spreadsheet. These spreadsheets would typically have maybe hundreds of millions of interactions, but it's enough just to look at the first three. So you might have a date stamp, so you know the day when that interaction took place. You might know the event type. You would know the start time, so VC might stand for a voice call. So on this day, at this time, this person placed a phone call to this person. It was a voice call, and it lasted for 185 seconds. And while this call was taking place, this person was located in area 54, which is just some random ID for some cell tower location, and this person was located in location 42. So you can see how you can use these. As soon as you know the locations of the cell towers, you know where these people were approximately at the time of the call, and you can also construct networks. So you can do two things. You can construct networks, and you can ask interesting spatial questions. Well, what are the kinds of things that we might be able to do with data like these? Let's start with a classic example. This actually goes back to sociology in the early 70s. So historically, it's been very hard to collect network data, especially at scale. So we might be able to, and people have been doing this since the 1930s, it's possible to go to a classroom of school children, 20, 25 students, and ask each of them, whom do you know? So this is pretty straightforward. It's simple surveys and so on. But this approach doesn't scale. In a conference of 500 people, we simply cannot give everybody a list of 500 names and ask them to tick what are the names you know. Then think about, going even beyond this scale. Think about this at the level of cities or countries or continents. So the standard approach doesn't scale. So what data like these have enabled us to do is to take interesting hypotheses, interesting scientific questions, and try to see to what extent these hypotheses might hold at large societal scale. So one way I like to think about social networks and human societies in general is as icebergs like this. So imagine yourself on the top of this iceberg, and everybody you know and everybody whom you've ever seen is going to be in this part of the iceberg, the very tip of the iceberg. But 99.99999% of the world is underneath the surface. These are the people you've never seen, you've never met. They're not your friends. If we think about applications like epidemiology or public health, it's somewhat important what goes on in the tip of the iceberg. But what's really important is what's going on in this part of the iceberg, which is essentially all of it. So the idea here is that these data have enabled us to investigate not just this bit over here, but the entire object. And there are all kinds of limitations to the work that we've done, and we can talk about that. But in principle, that's a pretty big change in scale and scope. Now, let's think about the classic hypothesis. So in 1973, Mark Granovetter published a paper called The Strength of Weak Ties, which since then has become one of the most cited papers in the social sciences. How many of you know about this paper? Great, quite a few of you. Usually I get to make up the hypothesis, but in this case I actually have to be pretty truthful to what Mark did. So this is the idea. It makes a statement, this hypothesis makes a statement about the strength of the tie and the structure of the network that surrounds that tie. And it's a beautiful, elegant hypothesis because precisely of its simplicity. And here's the idea. Think about two people who are connected by a tie. What the hypothesis says is, the stronger the tie between two people, the higher the fraction of friends we have in common. This is, of course, a statement about the average. Nobody knows about a single individual tie, but if we think about two people who have a strong tie, you would expect them to share lots of friends. If they have a weak tie, you would expect that they don't have many friends in common. So what we decided to do was to take this hypothesis and see, can we investigate this at scale? So I will not talk about the numbers. We used a data set that had about 7 million people, about 30 million something ties, and so on. You can read about all these details in the paper if you're interested. But to investigate this hypothesis, we need to decide on two things. How do we quantify this notion of shared friends, and how do we quantify tie strength? Again, I'm skipping some of the details, but the idea is we can define a simple quantity that pertains to every single edge in the network. So let's look at two individuals, I and J. They have a tie connecting the two of them. The quantity that we call overlap is going to be 0 if I and J have no friends in common. They still have friends, but they just don't have friends in common. When the overlap is equal to 1, that means that all of their friends are common. In other words, they don't have any non-common friends. And in reality, in the real world, we would expect most situations to fall somewhere in between these two. So now we have a way to quantify the notion of shared friends. The second question is, well, how do we quantify tie strength? The simplest absolute thing that we can do is we can aggregate all phone calls over a period of a couple of months, say in this case. And we simply add up the durations of the phone calls. So I call you a couple of times, you call me a couple of times. We just keep adding up the durations. And we get some number, 1,257 seconds. And fine, we take that at face value. That's the strength of our tie. Again, there are all kinds of issues with this. One can do something much, much, much more sophisticated, but this would be a starting point. So let's take the simplest thing that we can do. Now let's look at the plot. This is our result. So what we have on the x-axis here is the strength of the tie. So these are in terms of percentiles. So imagine that you have 30 million ties in your network. For every tie, you know two things. You know how strong that tie is, And you also know what is the overlap for that particular tie. So you have 30 million pairs of numbers. And what we do here is, for every single tie, we ask, what is the overlap for that tie? But it gets messy to interpret these results. So instead, we do the following. We're looking here at the strength of the tie in terms of percentiles. So the median tie strength would be at 0.5. The strongest tie would be at 1, and the weakest tie would be at 0. And we've divided our data into 40 or 50 bins or so. And what we do plot here is the average overlap for the ties in that category. And what the hypothesis is telling us is the stronger the tie, the higher the fraction of friends these people have. So the hypothesis says that we should have a monotone curve that keeps going up and up and up. And it turns out that this is pretty much what we have. So let's look at the black solid dots here. So weak ties have relatively low overlap, but as you move from weak to strong ties, the average overlap increases about threefold. So that's a pretty strong effect. The hypothesis does not seem to hold for the absolute strongest ties in the top 5%, but it does seem to hold pretty much for the first 90% or 95% of data. So this was a way for us to take a classic hypothesis, use the data that we could get, and ask this question at a national scale. But in some ways, if you have data at this scale, you'd like to ask more macroscopic questions. So this is what we decided to do next. We wanted to understand the role of weak and strong ties in holding the society together in some ways. When I say the society, I'm really thinking about the macroscopic network. So we wanted to learn about the role of weak and strong ties for holding this system together. So here, just to build a little bit of, and you may or may not be able to see this, we have a small sample of the entire network. One of the great things about big data is that even a small sample of a big data set is still a pretty big data set. In this case, we have about 2,000 or 3,000 nodes. The nodes are so tiny that they're kind of hard to see, but I think you can infer their location. So for example, here we have a node, and this node has a few connections coming out of it, and so on. Now, the ties in this plot have been color-coded, so that the strong ties, meaning a lot of talking, are colored in red, and the weak ties are colored in yellow. Now we can do the following. We can remove 80% of the ties and just leave 20% of the ties in place. And we can do this in two different ways. So that's why this is even harder to see. So in both of these plots, we have 20% of the ties left. So it must be that we have the same number of ties by constructions, 20% of the total count. What we have on the left is we have 20% of the weakest ties in place. On the right, we have 20% of the strongest ties in place. So you see that on the right, the picture is pretty fragmented. So you have strong ties, which seem to be within the cores of relationships, but the whole big picture is fragmented. What we have on the left, on the other hand, is it's a pretty thin graph because remember we've lost 80% of our ties, but nevertheless you have some type of global connectivity left. Now this is a visualization. It's based on a small sample, and visualizing network data is especially difficult for complicated mathematical reasons. It has to do with the fact that you're cutting down dimension from millions or thousands to just 2, so a lot gets lost in that translation process. But nevertheless, this intuition is right, and this can be confirmed using more sophisticated methods. So what is the message? The message is that we have the structure of social networks at scale consists of groups of nodes that are densely connected to one another, but these groups themselves are only weakly connected to other groups. So this is the kind of structure that emerges out of the analysis that we did. And this is, again, just a visualization, just to give the intuition. I want to make sure that we get to cover other things, but I just want to mention in passing that we also ask questions like, well, how does information or how do infections spread on networks? And again, I'm very happy to talk about this more offline. Why was this a useful data set for investigating this question? Well, at least for 2 reasons. One was that it's hard to get data at scale using traditional methods. So that's one benefit of using the data set that we did use. The second is that as hard as it is to collect network data at scale, it's even harder to collect network data where you have some kind of weights on ties. So we did this analysis where we started a simulation study. We infect some people in the system, and we let the infection spread. And what we found was that given the structure of the social network, if your spreading process is more likely to go through strong ties than weak ties, as might be reasonable to expect, many of these infectious processes, be they epidemiological or informational, tend to get stuck in these local groups, in these local communities. So imagine you start a spreading process. The process has to start somewhere. It starts in one of these groups and very quickly infects everybody in this community. But this is where you have a bottleneck for this process. It takes time for the infection to escape this community and reach other, what are called naive communities. And that's when the spreading process can continue. So you can do all kinds of things using this. Since time always goes faster than you think, I just want to mention this is some of the work that we did, but I want to make sure that we get to talk about all the other interesting things that we did. This is a modeling approach. I will not talk about any of the details here, but the key idea here is the following. If your network samples have of the order of 10 or 20 or 30 nodes, it's very hard to ask questions like, how should I model societal networks? Because you've never seen such an object. But when you get to observe networks that have millions of nodes in them, we can develop all kinds of models that try to mimic the structure of real-world social networks. And in this case, there is just one parameter that gets changed as we go from here to here to here to here. And what that parameter captures intuitively is the idea that if I interact with someone, the fact that I've interacted with you today should make it more likely for us to interact in the future. If that's not the case, we get structure that looks something like this, but the trouble is, this network is nothing like real-world social networks. Most real-world social networks look something like more like this or like this. So one could take these data, you could take, cell phone call data from Sweden and cell phone call data from Italy, and you could ask questions like, how much tie reinforcement is there? Well, why would you care about something like this if you're in the realm of tourism? And that's really, I think, ultimately something that you have to decide. But for example, if we're interested in something like the spread of reviews online or the use of social media, it would be important to understand the structure of connections in these systems, because even in that context, remember, people don't exist as atomized units. So for example, I might trust your review more than I trust a review of a random person and so on. So I think that there would be value to doing this. All right, let's look at something else. We have 10 more minutes, is that correct? Yeah. Great. Time is flexible, even more. Thank you. All right, let's switch gears. This is as bad as the morning traffic is in Lugano. There are places where traffic gets even more busy than over here. This is a picture of what's called the Kumbh. The Kumbh is a religious Hindu festival. How many of you know about the Kumbh? So the Kumbh has been taking place for hundreds of years, maybe even longer. So it takes place every year. But there's something very special about this festival. It's a Hindu religious festival taking place in India. Although it takes place every year, every 12 years, you have a scaled-up version of this festival. And every 144 years, you have an even more scaled-up version of this festival. It's a geometric series or something like that. And they had one of these bigger events, as was mentioned in the introduction, in 2013. One of these events that only happens every 144 years. So what can we do? Well, we got access to cell phone call data for a small percentage, about maybe 20% of the people who attended this event. And we've been studying for the last couple of years all kinds of aspects of this gathering. I will only show you the couple of very basic findings, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that, again, we can ask given these data. Our study period goes from January 1st to March 31st, so it's a 3-month period. It's a geographical spatial area which is covered by 207 cell phone towers. So imagine that this is in this schematic, this is the area of the Kumbh. Imagine dividing that to about 200 small cells. So we don't know exactly where a person is when they use their phone, but we do know things like, are you in this cell or in that cell? We have all of the incoming and outgoing voice calls and text messages, and these data were provided to us by one major Indian cell phone operator. So the way this work has progressed is that we've actually never had the data. So data and privacy are huge questions, and I could talk about this for want to do that right now. But in this case, we did not have any of these data. So how could we do any of this work? So the way we worked is that we wrote the scripts in Boston. We sent the code over to India. Our collaborators at the company analyzed the data, and they sent us the summary results. So none of the data actually ever left the computers at the company. Now, in this case, we knew the area codes. So it's just like in Switzerland, you have area codes. In every country, there are area codes. So you can learn something about where are people coming from. For example, in this case, to attend this particular event. So we divided India into 23 different states. And because we know the area code, we know that you're from the Delhi area, you're from here, and so on. The actual location of the festival is given by this yellow star over here. This is where the festival actually took place. So in this case, we can figure out how many people attended the festival from here, 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 and so on. We can rank these numbers, and this is what we find. Red is high, blue is low. So most of the people came from this area, which makes a lot of sense. It's geographically close. The least number of people came from here, 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 and so on. There's nothing surprising about this per se, but this type of analysis enables us to quantify who attended this festival. And there are a number of reasons why we would like to do something like that. But we can also ask more interesting questions. In this case, we had about 400 million data points, 146 million text messages, and 245 million voice calls. What we're plotting in this, and again, just to give you some intuition, this is time on the x-axis. We have 90 days. And the y-axis gives us the number of data points. We have two kinds of data. We have calls and text messages, so we have two curves. And you can see that there's a lot of activity going on. And it does seem like there are some days when you have a lot of activity going on. So this suggests that we might be able to look at the size of the population at any given day at this particular event. So although the data cover a period of 3 months, most people attending this festival might show up for a week or two or something like that. Almost nobody would stay for more than a couple of months. And it turns out that there's one major bathing day which coincides exactly with this high peak over here. By the way, what's shown here is, okay, let me explain that first. What we're looking at here is the number of unique handsets used on the given day. So what does that mean? So every time the clock hits midnight, then some people will start making their phone calls. So we keep track of exactly how many handsets were used in that 24-hour period and how many SIM cards were used in that 24-hour period. In this case, we wanted to track both because it could be that people have multiple SIM cards or multiple phones or something like this. But it turns out that the two curves coincide pretty nicely. So in this case, we were able to find that we had a substantially larger population on the main bathing day than on the days surrounding that. We can also pick out the two other main days, which is this peak over here and this peak over here. So what would this enable us to do? So for example, if you think about a standard problem in epidemiology, imagine that on one day you have 10 cases of illness X. The next day or week later, you have 20 cases of disease X. Do you have an epidemic or not? Well, to determine that simple question, you need to know how many people you have. So it could be that you have twice as many cases of that illness because the population size has just doubled. But if the population size has remained constant, then you might have an epidemic. So a very simple analysis like this will enable us to determine things like, could it be the case that we have an epidemic of X or Y or Z, which is in and of itself quite helpful when you're planning an event that, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, this is my key statistic. Approximately an estimated 100 million people attended this event. 100 million people. If that's correct, this is supposed to be the biggest gathering of people in the history of humanity. So that's a lot of people. I'm from Finland, and we have 5 million people. And so it seems like a really big party from my perspective. All right, something else that we can do is, imagine that you wanted to plan an event like this. You know, who knows? So it would be helpful to know how many people have attended this event. For example, there are hospitals that operate here. You have to bring lots of food. People don't leave this area. They enter the area, they stay there for a week, 2 or 3, and they exit the area. So you have to know, if you're planning on something like this, you have to know how many people are there. So you can do things like, you can do satellite imaging, and people have done stuff like this. But here's the challenge. You can take all the pictures you want using a satellite, but typically what you get to see is today we seem to have this many people, yesterday we had this many people, and so on. What's the challenge? How do you know if those are the same set of people that you had there on 2 or 3 or 4 consecutive days, or how do you know if some of those people left home and new people arrived? So it's going to be some churn in the population, but it's very, very hard, essentially impossible to track that using satellite imaging. What we can do is, and I'm not going into any technical details, this is the first plot that came out of this. We can now keep track of the number of unique SIM cards that have been used at the festival area. And you can see that, so this, because it's a cumulative number, it has to be going up. It cannot decrease. We see 3 shoulders over here, and these correspond to the 3 big bathing days of the Kuhn. And now taking these data, and given that we know the market share of the company in different areas, and because we know the areas people come from, we can take these numbers and try to estimate the actual number of people. And this is probably, according to my postdoc, this work will be finished tomorrow. I was hoping that it would have been finished yesterday so I could have shared our estimate, but this is work that we're very, very close to completing. Let me show you one specific result related to this project. Now, there's the notion of homophily. Homophily, we can talk about homophily in the context of networks. We can also talk about homophily in the spatial context. So what network homophily refers to is the idea that people who are friends with one another, who are tied together through a social tie, tend to be more similar to one another than if you were to pick people at random from the population. So if you're Italian, lots of your friends are Italians. And if you're educated, a lot of your friends are educated and so on. So network homophily is a common thing. What spatial homophily means is that people that share some attribute, maybe age, sex, something else, they might be more likely to be in some area at the same time. So what we did in this case, we wanted to quantify essentially the cliquishness. So given that we know that you come from some state in the country, how likely are you to seek out the company of people from the same country? So if we threw together a CUM in Europe, imagine 100 million people, the question essentially would be, do people from Finland, would they like to find other people who are also from Finland and hang out with these people within the same cells? Remember, the cells are now the areas within the CUM that are governed by independent cell phone towers. And an interesting finding is, and it turns out that answering this question is a lot more challenging technically than we realized, but I think we do have an answer now. And one way to summarize these findings is that it does seem that the smaller the state where you come from, not in absolute terms, but in terms of representation at the event, meaning the fewer people you have from your own state attending the event, the larger your tendency is to try to seek out those people. So Switzerland is a small nation, Finland is a small nation. So if we did a CUM in Europe, all Finns would be trying to find the other Finns, all the Swiss would be doing the same. That's a huge generalization and certainly doesn't convey any of the subtleties, but that does seem to be the conclusion here. Let me take maybe I'll take a few minutes to talk about mental health, and we can take a couple of questions, and then I'm happy to talk offline. All right, so that was about social networks and human behavior. In a different project, and this is now we're switching gears. So now we're going to, remember I showed that plot where we had sample size on the x-axis and richness of data on the y-axis. And all the work that I've talked about until this point dealt with the point over here where we had large sample size and data were somewhat rich, but not maybe incredibly rich. Now the work that I'm going to talk about for the next flexible 5 minutes pertains to the other data point, which is where you have a lot smaller sample size, but data are much richer. So let me try to give an overview of some of the work that we're doing. The work, by the way, is not exclusively devoted to mental health. We're also interested in neurological disorders and things like this, but I'll just speak about mental health. So if you think about diagnosis of mental health, it's currently almost entirely based on self-reported symptoms, okay? And that does seem problematic at face value. So imagine you go to see your PCP, instead of the person asking, what is your blood pressure? This would be one way to do this. The person would ask you, how tall are you? What is your weight? What is your heart rate? What is your blood pressure? This would be a self-reported way to do this. But your PCP would never agree to this. He or she would certainly want to put you on the scale, measure how tall you are, take your blood pressure, and so on. But unfortunately, in mental health, almost everything, especially at the initial diagnosis stage, is based on self-reported symptoms. So you can imagine all kinds of issues there. Also, what's known as the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in the US, is very controversial. That's another topic on its own. So what we're doing here in my group, and this is funded by the NIH, is following two things. One, the idea was to develop an application that can be used on a smartphone to collect all kinds of sensor data. And the main thing that we want to do is we want to develop algorithms, new statistical learning techniques that are better suited to analyzing these kinds of data than your standard techniques like linear regression or something like that. And you could argue that we have already like 1 million applications, so why do we need 1,000,001? Well, the point really is that this is a scientific application, not a commercial application. So our goal is to try to pull in all the sensor data we can. This application will be, it's going to be open source. So not only can anyone use it who wants to use it, we can actually see what is the code, what is the source code inside that application. And we will also, in the next 4 or 5 years, we'll be developing a suite of software that can be used for analyzing these data. So what is the ultimate goal of this project? Well, we have quite a few goals for this, but the idea is one of the main initial goals is to try to come up with a way of classifying psychopathologies based on dimensions of behavior that we can actually observe. Things we can observe in a person, as opposed to asking a person to self-report. I think that's a big shift. In the future, actually not in that far future, we hope that we might be able to monitor and predict treatment response. And ultimately, we might be able to deliver interventions and intervene and so on. Now, we could apply the same framework outside of psychiatric illnesses, for example, on neurological disorders. And it's a term that I've started using lately, which is what I call deep phenotyping. So genotype is obviously our ancestry, our genetic heritage. Phenotype is the manifestation, physical manifestation of that. But it's very hard to quantify the phenotype accurately. And this is what this project aims to do. So using the remaining 3 minutes, perhaps. So the
flexible 5 minutes.
Flexible,
not inflexible.
Okay, flexible 5 minutes. I like that. So the idea is that if we think about why is this potentially a useful idea, well, now we can collect all kinds of behavioral data that would be unimaginable 10 years ago. Imagine we're now in a situation where we can record every phone call, we can almost record every heartbeat, every step can certainly be recorded. So it's so much data that we can potentially use. So the idea is we can use, these are long-term illnesses, months or years. So instead of having a very heavy instrumentation, the idea is to have light instrumentation, which would hopefully enable us to collect data points, not just over days or weeks, but months and potentially years. And we can collect two different kinds of data. So one type of data is what I call active data. I call it active data because it's the kind of data that involves active participation on the side of the person. The other kind of data is what we call passive data, which is data collected by smartphone sensors. Let me give you just a couple of examples, and I will actually, I won't be using the slides because I want to make sure that I get to convey the main message. What would be an example of active data collection? So we've done two things so far. One thing is we've started doing what I call micro-surveys. So instead of doing one survey a month or one survey every 3 months, we've actually started doing daily surveys. How do we get these people to do daily surveys? In fact, in one pilot, we asked people to do 3 surveys a day, morning, afternoon, and in the evening. Why are these people taking all these surveys? The idea is that we might have a huge battery of questions we want to ask, maybe 40, 50 questions, but it doesn't make sense to ask those questions all the time. That's why we're in the process of developing an adaptive survey technique. So the idea is, imagine you're talking to a person, and the person has now asked you, the person has asked me, say, the last 30 days, how good is your appetite? And 30 times I've responded, I have a great appetite, I have a great appetite. Now day 31 comes around. The person would not be asking that question again because you already have 30 responses. So though asking that same question again would not add any more information. So that's the idea. We essentially get to specify there's something we want to calculate, whether it's your PHQ-9 score or something else. We can try to find the ideal set of questions, the set of questions that are going to be most informative for that person at that point in time. And this is, I think, an interesting development because as long as we're using surveys that are printed on paper, we have zero space, zero room for customization. But as soon as we start introducing smartphones and online surveying, we can do all kinds of things that are much more sophisticated. Another example of active data, again, deals with collecting voice samples. So we know from the past work of some other people that you can collect vocal markers for things like depression. So for example, the extent to which your speech, the pitch of your speech varies over time can be used as an indicator for depression. This type of work until now has been done in labs. So you book an appointment, and 6 weeks from today, you go and give a voice sample. Then 6 weeks later, you give your second voice sample, and so on. Now we can have people give voice samples in their homes, which really, I think, is changing this whole landscape. So instead of going to a lab, which is artificial setting, you can give a voice sample in your home. And we have some interesting results for that. Now, these are active data. The passive data in the flexible 1 minute that I have refers to all of the sensor data that we can pull in. And there's too much to describe. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Imagine that one of the things we can do is use GPS traces to try to learn about the mobility of individuals. Well, there's nothing new. A lot of people are doing this kind of thing. But imagine combining that with data on social communication. So now we know how much does a person move around and how many people do you talk to. How many people do you talk to on the phone, how many people do you SMS, and so on. Now imagine a hypothetical patient who is bipolar. So you go through these hyperphases and phases of being depressed. If the person is really depressed and if the phone rings, what do you think that person is going to do? That person is going to be unlikely to pick up the phone. Is that person going to be running around? Unlikely. That person might be stuck at home or just maybe moving a little bit. When that person becomes manic, what happens now when the phone rings? The person is probably going to pick up the phone, making lots of phone calls, running around, and so on. So taking all these sensor data, we hope to be able to better understand where is that person. Then we can start to think about treatment. Once we can measure response, we can try to optimize treatment. And maybe instead of taking 2 or 3 months to figure out, does this treatment work for this person, maybe we can shrink that to 2 or 3 weeks or something like this. So lots of ideas here. Work has been done in collaboration with we're skipping a few things here. All of this work has been done in collaboration with my wonderful colleagues, and I'm very fortunate to have truly fantastic students and truly fantastic postdocs, and I'm very grateful to all of them, and I'm grateful to you for being here today. So thank you very much.